When my grandfather passed away 10 years ago, I never expected that his final gift to me would become the center of so much chaos, conflict, and outright harassment. But that's exactly what happened when I inherited a stretch of land just outside of town, a property that had been in our family for generations, tucked away in a part of the county that nobody seemed to care about until the city began expanding outward and developers started sniffing around. At first, when the deed was handed to me, I thought of it as a sentimental inheritance rather than a financial windfall, because the land was mostly forest, a long, winding dirt road, and a small cabin that had been my grandfather's retreat from the bustle of daily life. And since I was in my mid 20s then and struggling to find my footing in the world, I saw it more as a quiet refuge than anything else, a place where I could escape with a book, clear my head, and try to figure out life. But as the years went by, something started changing in the world around me. The sleepy little county where this land sat began booming with real estate projects, shiny new neighborhoods sprouting up on every corner, and what used to be farmland was suddenly filled with concrete slabs, manicured lawns, and the telltale signs of homeowners associations springing up like weeds. At first, I didn't pay much attention because my land sat on the edge of this expansion, and I assumed nobody would bother me. But then the first letter arrived in my mailbox, a neatly printed, self-important notice from an HOA I didn't belong to, claiming that I needed to clear brush along my fence line, paint my cabin, and bring my property into compliance with their bylaws. And I remember laughing out loud at the audacity, crumpling the paper, and tossing it aside because I knew perfectly well that my grandfather's land had never been part of any HOA agreement, nor had he ever signed anything to subject the property to one. But what started as a nuisance quickly escalated into something much more sinister. The HOA, clearly emboldened by their power over the new neighborhoods, kept sending me notices, fines, and demands that I either join voluntarily or face consequences. And when I ignored them, they began sending representatives to knock on my door, clipboard in hand, trying to inspect my property like they had some sort of legal authority. And when I told them to get lost, they called the cops, claiming I was uncooperative and in violation of community standards. The first time the cops showed up, even they seemed confused, because when I showed them the deed and county records proving my land was exempt from any HOA, they scratched their heads and admitted there was nothing they could do. But that didn't stop the HOA from trying again and again, each time with a different excuse, noise complaints when I had friends over, allegations that my old truck parked on the dirt road was an abandoned vehicle, even claims that my grandfather's cabin violated aesthetic regulations, which was laughable since it had been built decades before the HOA neighborhoods even existed. And while the harassment was frustrating, I initially brushed it off, figuring it was a case of overzealous board members who would eventually get bored and move on. But things only escalated as the land itself grew more valuable, because one day I got an unsolicited offer in the mail a developer offered me several $1 million to sell, with promises of turning the property into a luxury extension of their already sprawling subdivision. And while I could have been tempted, I remembered my grandfather's words when he handed me the keys to the cabin for the first time. This land is freedom. Don't ever let anyone take it from you unless it's your choice. And so I politely declined, but that refusal seemed to throw gasoline on the fire, because not long after, the HOA's attempts to intimidate me became relentless, with more police visits, more letters threatening lawsuits, and even strange cars parking near the edge of my land, clearly watching, clearly waiting for me to slip up. And though I held firm, it began to feel less like an annoyance and more like a war, one that I hadn't asked for but would have to fight if I wanted to keep the inheritance my grandfather had entrusted to me. The first time I realized the HOA wasn't just going to harass me with paperwork, but was actually determined to use intimidation tactics. It was late one Saturday afternoon when I heard the sound of tires crunching down the gravel path leading to the cabin, and when I stepped out onto the porch, there were two patrol cars slowly making their way up the hill, their lights flashing as if I were some kind of criminal. I leaned against the railing, arms crossed, waiting for them to come to a stop, and when the officers got out, they looked more uncomfortable than authoritative, which told me right away This was another wild goose chase sent in by the HOA. Sure enough, one officer cleared his throat and said, "Sir, we received a call about a possible squatter situation here." And I couldn't help but laugh out loud because I knew this was now the third different excuse they had used in just 2 weeks. First, it was a noise complaint, then some nonsense about illegal dumping, and now they were trying to claim I wasn't even the rightful owner of my own land. So I walked inside, grabbed the big leather-bound folder where I kept every deed, title, tax record, and even a notarized letter from the county confirming my property wasn't under HOA jurisdiction, and when I spread it out on the hood of their cruiser, both cops exchanged looks like they'd seen this before, which meant the HOA had wasted their time multiple times already, and after a few apologies, they left me alone. But the seed of irritation had been planted deeper, not at the police who were just doing their jobs, but at the arrogance of a group of neighbors who thought they could bully me off land my family had owned for nearly a century. As the weeks went on, it became almost routine. Every few days, a fresh notice in the mailbox, usually demanding some fee or fine for violations that didn't exist, or another cop showing up because someone had called 911 to report suspicious activity on my land, and it began to dawn on me that this wasn't just harassment, it was strategy, a coordinated effort to wear me down, to make life so inconvenient that I'd eventually give in and sell. But what they didn't know was that I had grown up watching my grandfather fight tooth and nail to protect what was his, whether it was fending off county officials trying to take parts of the land for a new road or shutting down hunters who trespassed without permission, and he had passed that stubborn streak straight down to me. So instead of breaking, I dug in my heels and decided to start documenting every single incident. I bought a set of security cameras, put up motion sensor lights along the drive, and even installed a trail cam deep in the woods where I'd noticed a couple of strangers lurking before. And within a month, I had hours of footage showing HOA board members, sometimes even accompanied by the very same developer who had tried to buy my land, sneaking around near the property line, taking photos, pointing at the cabin, and clearly planning something. Armed with this evidence, I marched down to the county sheriff's office and filed a formal harassment complaint, and though the deputy who took my statement admitted these HOAs often acted like little governments, he also said the law was on my side, so I left feeling a little more empowered. But that didn't stop the games. One evening, right after sunset, I heard loud banging at the door, and when I opened it, 3 HOA representatives were standing there, holding clipboards with smug expressions plastered across their faces. One woman, who introduced herself as the compliance chair, announced that I had been officially fined for keeping livestock in violation of community code, and when I asked her what livestock she was talking about, she gestured dramatically toward my grandfather's old barn, where my 2 dogs had been playing outside just minutes earlier, and I swear I almost lost it laughing because she was actually trying to pass off my dogs as livestock. But when I told them once again they had no jurisdiction here and that if they didn't leave my porch, I would call the sheriff, her smugness twisted into something darker, and she hissed, "You can make this easy or hard on yourself, but you're going to sell eventually," before storming off into the night. That was the moment it hit me that this wasn't going to blow over because these people weren't just nosy neighbors with too much time on their hands. They were part of a bigger plan, one likely tied to the developer waving millions of dollars under the HOA's nose. And if they couldn't buy me out, they were going to try to break me with fear and constant surveillance. But what they didn't count on was that I had already decided, no matter how much they tried, no matter how many cops they sent, I wasn't giving up this land, not for them, not for anyone, because this land was more than dirt and trees. It was a promise, and I intended to keep it. By the time the third year of this battle rolled around, I had grown used to the constant disruptions, but the HOA's tactics had shifted from nuisance-level harassment to outright attempts at sabotage, and it all came to a head one scorching July afternoon when I returned from town to find a bright orange condemned notice taped to the cabin door, as though my grandfather's carefully maintained retreat was some kind of unsafe ruin. I tore the notice down immediately, but before I even finished reading the absurd allegations, structural instability, Unpermitted electrical wiring, violation of community building codes. A county inspector pulled up in a white truck, clipboard in hand, and politely explained that he'd been called out after several complaints were filed against the property, complaints that once again all trace back to the HOA. I walked him through the cabin, showing him the updated wiring I'd paid a licensed electrician to handle, the sturdy beams my grandfather had built by hand, and the most recent inspection papers that I'd already filed with the county. And within 20 minutes, the inspector shook his head with a chuckle and told me everything was perfectly in order, even muttering under his breath that he was tired of being dragged out to my land for nonsense every other week. But that didn't erase the pit in my stomach, because while I could handle cops knocking at my door or letters piling up in a mailbox, the idea of them trying to weaponize county offices against me meant they were willing to escalate to a whole new level. Sure enough, within days, I noticed more strange behavior. Surveyors walking suspiciously close to the property line, clipboard-wielding men in suits peering through binoculars from parked cars across the road, and even a drone buzzing overhead late one night, its camera light blinking red as it hovered over the cabin. And that was when I knew they were no longer just harassing me. They were gathering evidence, or at least pretending to build some kind of case. But what they failed to understand was that I had been documenting just as much as they had, and by now, my folder had grown into an entire filing cabinet filled with video clips, timestamps, license plate numbers, and even audio recordings of board members threatening me my face. And the more they pushed, the more determined I became to turn their arrogance into their undoing. One particularly memorable evening, I came home to find two sheriff's deputies waiting again, this time saying they had been told I was storing hazardous chemicals in my barn, and when I swung open the doors to reveal nothing but gardening supplies, some old tools, and a lawnmower, both deputies rolled their eyes and apologized, admitting they were being used as pawns in some ridiculous feud. And I realized that even law enforcement was getting sick of the HOA's antics, which only made me bolder. I began attending county meetings, standing up during the public comment sections, and laying out evidence of how a private neighborhood association was abusing emergency services and county resources to harass a legal landowner. And though the board members would often show up too, sitting in the back with tight-lipped smirks, I could see that their confidence was beginning to waver, especially when local reporters started sniffing around after hearing whispers of $1 million land dispute. It all boiled over. When the HOA made one final desperate play, they filed a civil complaint against me in county court, alleging that I was a public nuisance and that my land, if left in my hands, would devalue the surrounding community. A laughable argument considering property values in the area had skyrocketed largely because of the natural beauty preserved by land like mine. But instead of panicking, I hired a sharp local attorney who specialized in property rights, and together we built a case that not only dismantled every one of their bogus claims, but also turned the spotlight on their harassment, bringing forth the mountain of evidence I had collected for years. The day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed, HOA board members in their suits on one side, neighbors whispering among themselves, reporters scribbling notes, and me sitting calmly with my attorney and thick binders of proof. And when the judge finally read through the details, her expression shifted from confusion to irritation to outright disbelief, because not only did the HOA have no jurisdiction, but they had wasted years of taxpayer-funded resources dragging law enforcement into a dispute they had no legal standing in. When she dismissed the complaint with prejudice and even hinted that sanctions against the HOA might be appropriate, I felt a wave of vindication, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. And though the battle wasn't fully over, I knew the tide had turned. The law was on my side, the county was on my side, and even the public was beginning to see that this wasn't just a stubborn man clinging to land. It was a story about power, greed, and a community association that had overstepped so far they'd become a caricature of their own arrogance. But as I walked out of that courthouse, hearing the muttered curses of the board members behind me, I also knew deep down that they weren't going to give up quietly, not when a developer was dangling multi-million-dollar checks in front of them. And so, even in victory, I braced myself for whatever scheme they were planning next, because if there's one thing I had learned in this fight, it was that people blinded by greed don't quit, they double down. After the court case, I thought maybe, just maybe, the HOA would finally crawl back into its corner and lick its wounds. But I should have known better because greed doesn't die when it's embarrassed, it only festers. And within months, I realized their strategy had shifted from legal intimidation to psychological warfare, with every trick designed to make me feel isolated on my own land. First, it was the petty stuff. Strangers parking at the edge of my driveway with their engines idling, unfamiliar cars creeping by at odd hours of the night, and anonymous letters slipped into my mailbox telling me I was ruining the community by refusing to sell. But then it escalated into more dangerous games, like finding nails scattered deliberately across the dirt road that led to my cabin, or hearing the sound of chainsaws one morning and rushing out to catch two men, clearly hired hands, trying to cut down a line of trees along my northern fence, their excuse being that they thought the HOA had approved it, which of course was nonsense. I chase them off with a warning that next time the sheriff would be called before they even finished unloading their tools, but the message was clear: the HOA and their developer friends weren't finished, and they were willing to push boundaries until either I snapped or gave in. But instead of folding, I doubled down on protecting the land, investing in better cameras, upgrading my fencing, and even putting up clear no trespassing, private property signs every 50 feet along the boundary, backed by state law that carried real penalties. And while this made it harder for them to pretend ignorance, it didn't stop the harassment. It just made it more desperate. One evening, as I sat on the porch with my dogs, watching the sun set over the tree line, a squad car rolled up once again, this time with an officer I hadn't met before, and he stepped out cautiously, hat in hand, and explained that the HOA had filed yet another complaint, this time claiming I was running an illegal campground business by letting strangers stay overnight on the property. I laughed, told him the only overnight guests I'd ever had were family, and when I showed him the proof, he sighed, shook his head, and admitted quietly that his department had been inundated with calls from this HOA about me, wasting hours of their time every week. And though he couldn't say it officially, he hinted that the sheriff's patience was running thin, and that the HOA might soon find themselves facing charges for filing false reports. That gave me hope. But the bigger revelation came just a few weeks later when an investigative journalist from the local paper reached out to me, saying she had been digging into the relationship between the HOA and the developer, and what she uncovered was damning: emails, meeting minutes, and financial records showing that the board had been promised personal incentives, cash upgrades to their own homes, even spots on the developer's payroll if they could convince me to sell or somehow get control of the land. Suddenly, everything made sense, from their relentless fines to their attempts at bogus condemnation, because this wasn't about community aesthetics or property values. It was about greed at the highest level, and now that I had proof, I knew it was time to turn the tables. I worked with the journalist, handed over every shred of evidence I'd collected, and within a month, her expose hit the front page: HOA accused of harassing landowner in $10 million land grab. And overnight, the narrative shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't just some stubborn recluse clinging to land. I was a symbol of resistance against corruption, with neighbors, strangers, and even people from outside the county flooding my inbox with messages of support, some even offering free legal services if the HOA tried anything else. The backlash was immediate. At the next county meeting, angry residents confronted the HOA board demanding resignations, and within weeks, 3 board members stepped down in disgrace, leaving the rest scrambling to save face. And as for the developer, their polished PR machine tried to distance itself from the scandal, but leaked documents kept surfacing, tying them directly to the harassment, and soon their luxury expansion project was stalled, permits under review, investors pulling out. I won't pretend it was easy. Living under that cloud of harassment for years took a toll, nights when I lay awake listening for footsteps outside, days when I wondered if I should have just taken the money and spare myself the stress. But in the end, standing firm meant more than cashing a check ever could, because I had protected not just my grandfather's legacy, but also my own dignity, refusing to be bullied off what was rightfully mine. Today, that land is worth more than it ever was, not just in dollars, but in the peace it brings me. Because every morning I wake up, step onto the porch, and breathe in the same fresh air my grandfather once did, I know I won a battle most people would have surrendered, And though the HOA still exists in name, its power has been shattered, reduced to a shell of its former self, while the developer moved on to easier prey. In another county, people sometimes ask me why I didn't just sell and walk away, a multimillionaire, and my answer is always the same. Money comes and goes, but land, real land, the kind that carries the weight of family history and personal freedom, is irreplaceable. And if you let someone steal that from you, no amount of zeros on a check can buy back the respect you lose. So now, 10 years after I first inherited this place, when I sit in the old cabin with the fire crackling and the dogs at my feet, I smile knowing that not only did I keep my promise to my grandfather, but I proved something to myself too, that no HOA, no developer, no amount of harassment or intimidation can ever break a person who refuses to be broken.